Welcome to the Virtual CPA Success Show, where we're 100% focused on helping service-based businesses achieve success. Are you a business owner interested in learning how to scale your business? Has your business reached over $1 million in annual revenue? Then this podcast is for you.
Welcome to our episode today. We are very excited to have David Allen as our guest. David is the author of 3 books, including GTD, The Art of Stress-Free Productivity. That was originally published in 2001 and then revised in 2015. He's also the founder of the David Allen Company, an executive coaching firm where they coach and teach getting things done, also known as GTD, including one-day seminars. The book and his company have introduced GTD to over 2 million people. David claims to be a lazy person trying to be productive with the least amount of work possible. He currently lives in Amsterdam with his wife, Catherine. So David, welcome to our show.
Hey, thanks for the invitation, Tom and Jamie.
Anything,
glad to be here.
Yeah. Anything else you'd want to tell us about yourself? And then for some people who maybe aren't familiar with GTD, maybe just a quick summary of what it is.
Well, I spent the last 40 years of my life trying to figure out how do you get stuff done with as little effort as possible and get the right stuff done. I never had any traditional formal education in business psychology or time management. All this is street smart. Came out of my consulting practice with lots of small companies. I was a good number 2 guy for a number of companies. And I would just walk in and say, how much easier can we do this? I say, how much, because I'm the laziest guy you ever met. And so, as you mentioned, I said, how can we just leave earlier today, if we get this stuff done? So now they call that process improvement. I just said, let's just fix this so we don't have to work as hard and get out of here and do some other fun stuff. Then I'd fix it and get bored, go find another gig. And I discovered they call those folks something and they pay them, called consultant. So, okay, now I are one. And hung out my shingle, Allen Associates, 1982. Before you guys were probably born. I don't know.
I was born. I was born
as well, but I was definitely young.
Anyway, so and then I started to do it, and I had a background in sort of clear space out of my spiritual meditative practices, martial arts, got a black belt in karate. And a lot of that teaches how do you clear your head so that you're most present, be able to then engage with 4 people who jump in a dark alley or cook spaghetti or whatever you want to do, being present. Now there's all the being present, models out there these days, but I learned that 40 years ago. And so as my world got more complex and busy, I discovered, that's kind of screwing up my clear space. How do I stay clear and focused on the right things? Not be distracted. And so I found these techniques one by one. I didn't wake up one morning with this whole methodology. It was a long string of epiphanettes, as I say, over a period of 5 or 10 years. And I began to cobble them together. And what worked for me, I turn around and use with my clients. It worked for them too. They implemented these simple, but you're not born doing them, but these simple techniques, and more stability, more control, more focus, more ability to focus, more space to focus on the meaningful stuff. So that became a lot of the core of what I didn't call it coaching back then. It was mostly consulting with mostly small businesses. And then some big head of HR in a big corporate world saw what I was doing and said, David, we need that result in our whole culture. Can you design a training program around all this? I said, well, I'll do my best. So designed a 2-day personal productivity training. We did a pilot program for 1,000 executives and managers in Lockheed in 1983 and 84 in Burbank. And it hit a nerve. They said, this is the best training we've ever done, And suddenly I found myself thrust into the corporate training world. You could have fooled me. I was an American intellectual history major in graduate school in Berkeley in 1968. If you'd told me I was going to be doing that, I'd say, come on, what are you smoking? You kidding? Come. But it turned out that was the ripest audience for what I come up with. And, they were the fast track professionals in the world were getting hit with tsunami of the emails and changing organizations and flattened organizations. And people needed to manage themselves a lot better than they were doing. And so my stuff just hit a nerve. So found myself thrust into that world. And then for the next 20, 25 years, I trained hundreds of thousands of people in the corporate world and spent literally thousands of hours one-on-one coaching desk side with mid to senior level people in these companies, how to implement this for themselves personally. So that's where all this came from. At some point, it took me that long to figure out what I'd figured out. I thought I was the last guy in the world to figure all this stuff out. I'm coaching people making more money than I ever see in my life. I figured they already figured this out. No, they hadn't. As a matter of fact, the more senior they got, the more responsible they got, the more out of control they felt. And it doesn't get easier as you graduate, if you guys probably know that.
Yeah.
And so, that was my ripest audience. Great that I had got some of the busiest and brightest people in my network, that started to be champions of my work. And so I got some good coaching. David, you ought to write the book. Well, how do you write a book? I don't know. So that was where I said, okay. But by that time, I knew it worked. I had brought it into some of the most challenging environments you could ever bring something like that into, and it went viral in those cultures. And I said, well, if it worked for them, like Goldman Sachs, people like Deutsche Bank, people like, all kinds of places where we're just dealing with truly best and brightest folks. And it hit a nerve in those cultures. And so I said, okay, well, if they can't punch a hole in it, I don't think anybody else can. So that gave me the confidence to go ahead and write the book. At least the first edition would have been out in, as you mentioned, 2001.
Yeah.
And then I had no idea how popular it was going to be. I just needed to get that out of my head and capture kind of what I discovered in my 20 or 25 years of career and get it out in case I got run over by a bus. At least somebody to have a manual that they could pick it up and use it or learn it if they wanted to.
Uh-huh.
And then it turned out to be a bestseller. And then, long story short, we're now represented in 90 countries, 2 million copies of the book sold, and this stuff is kind of spread around the world because it hit a nerve globally, especially the tech world. The tech people really got onto this pretty fast because it provided a very intact model that they couldn't punch a hole in. And because it's tool agnostic or non-specific, people could use their own favorite gear to then implement these best practices. And they're not hard to do, but you're not born doing them. You're not born knowing how to learn spaghetti or how to cook spaghetti or how to speak Italian or how to raise kids. You got to figure those things out like this. You have to figure out how to make sure that your workflow works right. So again, long story short, that's what I figured out in my last 40 years is how do you manage the flow of work as an art and craft in your life? That's what I did.
Yeah. In my story, so I'm one of the full-time virtual CFOs that we have. And so in my role, I've got clients and I act as their CFO. So kind of mid-sized companies, $3 to $5 million in revenue. I read the book around 2001. I remember over spring break with my kids reading through and found it really interesting and then didn't come back to it till years later. Back in 2001, I was sort of in this mode that when I found something new, I was like, this is perfect. My life will never have stress in it if I just do this. And then of course, that's never true. You still have challenges. And when I came to this job 4 or 5 years ago, someone asked to give me a talk and they called it Getting Things Done. And so I picked back up the book and read through it and started a group, and the company and Jamie ran another one that we led people through and kind of went through and said, hey, how do we apply this methodology? And it's been really good. And then as I mentioned to Jamie preparing for this interview, it turns out both of us kind of went back through the book again and said, okay, are there certain things that we could be doing better than what we are currently? Jamie, I'd be curious your story and kind of how.
By the way, Tom, I've had somebody read the book 20 times and said it's a totally different book every time he read it.
I'm not surprised. Yes, I've reread chapters in this one. Yes,
I coached the head of the World Bank, a few years ago, and he said he'd been the head of Dartmouth College and he'd been the head of the World Health Organization, and he said every time he changed careers, he had to go reread the book because he had to sort of recalibrate and re-gear to whatever the next set of challenges and opportunities and stresses that he was going to be having to deal with. Yeah,
that's exactly that's exactly my story. So I read GTD the first time when I was working for one organization. So I was working for an organization as a director of accounting and kind of oversaw the whole accounting department. But again, it was a different type of organization because it was one company with one set of needs and everything like that. And so I read it at that time and really fell in love with it and became part of the cult, as you know, and our listeners hopefully know, is that if you search GTD, you can find it anywhere. You can find it in Reddit, you can find it on YouTube. Any tool out there that is used for organization has a write-up on how to use their tool for GTD. So OneNote, Trello, any tool out there has like a using Trello with GTD. And so I am part of that cult and part of the Reddits and all that group, and have always been a big fan of GTD. And then again, when I moved to Summit, I originally was a CFO like Tom. And so I'm like, okay, now I have 12 different clients and my work environment has completely changed. So I better read the book again. And then moved into into a director role, which I'm now the director of accounting. So I kind of oversee the department and want my CFOs and my accountants to have a similar methodology that they use. And so read it again. And so, you know, my daughter has the Harry Potter book, and you look at it and you're like, I don't even want to touch that thing. It's so gross. It has like food all over it. It's like she's read it 1,000 times. And the only book I have that's even close to that was my GTD book, because I've read it so many times and it has writing in it and all that. And so I'm definitely a huge fan, and my story with GTD has been a long one. But for this podcast, I would love to, you know, I don't want to talk about the basics. I know there's a lot out there about the basics of GTD, and hopefully someone listeing to this podcast has either read the book or watched a video to kind of get the basics. I want to kind of really gear it towards our listeners, which are client-facing organizations. So really the challenge with client-facing organizations similar to us is a lot of meetings. You know, our team is in meetings from 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. And so a lot of times they're back to back to back, and there's very little time to do anything other than those meetings. And so their day is pretty cramped. And I think that is both true for CPA firms as well as small businesses, especially service-based businesses. And then I think the other two factors that really pull in is they're pulled in a lot of directions. Like I mentioned, our CFOs might have 15 clients. So there's a lot of different people reaching out to them and really needing their time and needing what they do. And then I think the last part that makes it a little bit challenging is if you have 15 clients, every client has a different tool they want to use. You know, one client wants to use Asana, one wants to use Teams, one wants to use Slack. And so there's really a ton of inboxes when you're a service-based organization is what I found. So I'd love kind of to hear your thoughts on how a service-based organization or someone working in a service-based organization would go about implementing GTD and what specific things they need to think about that might be a little bit different than the basis model.
Well, nothing you mentioned is actually unique to the service industry. You know, come on, wall-to-wall meetings. Who's setting those meetings, by the way, and who's agreeing to them?
Yeah, so a lot of times it's the recurring meetings that we have with our clients, or that our clients have with their customers, where you know it's set by us, and so it's set by the employees, the people that are serving the client.
If you don't give yourself time after your meetings to process what happened at that meeting, you're going to eat it on the weekend.
Yep.
If you eat it at all, if not, you're going to regurgitate at the end of the week. You know,
For sure.
So
That's a good point.
You know, so come on, who's managing your schedule? So we know that it takes at least an hour a day to process what happens that day, just to clarify it and organize it appropriately, so it's not backed up on you. You know, like bad plumbing. And sometimes it just backs up, but that's where the weekly review comes in. You better be spending at least 2 hours at the end of your week to bring up the rear guard and catch up with all that stuff. So, you know, deep, you know, heavy client-based, you know, work that you do, you've got to process those meetings sooner than later. You go longer than 7 days, that's like trying to find a needle in a haystack to go back and recreate what happened in that meeting 10 days ago. You can do it within 7 days. That's why the weekly review actually has a neurological base to it. Mm-hmm. Anything that happened within the last 7 days, it's a lot easier for you to recreate in your head. Oh, that reminds me. Oh, that's right. I told them. Oh, that's right. Now, it's nice that you can do that daily so that you don't have that stuff back up. Sometimes you know, you can't help that. You do wall to walls, but stop doing wall to wall. Give yourself at least 10 minutes. You know, one of my partners in London, they don't schedule meetings any more than 50 minutes or 20 minutes or 80 minutes. Depends on whether it's an hour meeting or a half-hour meeting or whatever, so that people have time to get to the next meeting.
Yeah, exactly.
Not just process the stuff, but just to get on to the next meeting. You know,
that is very good practice.
As opposed to show up late. What happens when people show up late? How much money did that client lose based upon the loaded payroll cost of people sitting there waiting for a decent meeting to start?
Sure.
It's obscene. It's just obscene. Sorry, I'm 77. I'm a little cranky now, guys. So I don't see a lot of exceptions to that. There are some. There are outliers out there that sort of caught what this is about. They make sure meetings start on time. They make sure that there's a purpose for the meeting. They make sure that they don't end discussions without going, so what's the next step? What we just decide who's doing it. They don't invite people unless they need to be in that meeting based upon the role that they have. People not agreeing to go to a meeting unless they agree there's a reason for them to be there given their purpose. I mean, this is just conscious stuff.
Mhm.
But that's, and yes, that is GTD, but GTD is a good business.
Yeah,
It's
for
not,
sure.
yeah, I know you said
Mhm.
cult, but it's not a cult. Like, why would you start a meeting without going, what do we want to accomplish?
Yes.
Why would you end a discussion with a guy and say, what do we should decide? What's the next step? Yours or mine? We've seen whole cultures just change by building that vocabulary into their thought process. Because GTD is really more about a thought process than it is a systematic way to think about your stuff. And you can use any system, but once you understand the system, you have total freedom to how you actually implement it. Again, the first critical step in GTD is to capture stuff that has your attention, get it out of your head. What has your attention about that client meeting? What's not on cruise control based upon the conversation you just had with that client? What still needs something decided or done about it? By whom? When are you going to do that? When are you going to do that because that kind of thinking usually won't happen in the meeting. You need to sit down and sort of recalibrate and regroup and step back and lift up a little bit in space and time and take a look at what happened. Say, oh, okay. Even if you're taking notes, God bless you if you are, at least that. Then you can look at your notes and go, which one of these notes is critical? Which ones need to go into a CRM? Which one are just reference? Which ones do I just need to keep for myself for the next time I talk to my client? I know, what their child's name is and whether they like to play tennis or ski or, whatever. And all that is client support material. You just need to make sure you curate that, put it where it needs to go so you have access to it. You show up elegant.
Yeah, we participate with lots of clients in their meetings, and some follow this approach called EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System, that came out of the book Traction. So it's a way of doing things, but it's got a methodology for following meetings. And I've got one client that is led by an ex-military person, another one that's sort of the opposite if you think of that spectrum. What a dramatic difference. But one of the things is they capture to-dos and what the date is. And the beginning of the next meeting is just done or not done. Did you get done what you were going to say, what you said you would? And the one led by the ex-military is very efficient that people do those things. And the other, I was laughing this week, they've had something that was supposed to be done the next week and they mark how many weeks it's late. It's 59 weeks late. So they've gone more than a year. It's called Get Pictures of Our Drivers, put on the website. And it's just interesting to watch this, that they'll say they'll do something. And from the leader on down, they're not willing to actually commit and be clear and get those things done. So
what's not clear is who has the role to do it.
That's true. Yeah, and you can see a difference with a very clear.
If you don't have role, see, the military has very clear roles, relatively speaking. But what's the role of a CFO? You're going to be held accountable to have done what, by when, by whom? Are you clear about that? And role clarity is. By the way, I'm in the midst right now as we speak of finalizing our draft on the next book of getting teams done.
Oh,
basically. How do you work effectively with other people? Because that's been the big complaint that most people want over these 40 years. People get this stuff. They go, God, how do I get everybody around me to do this? My kids, my family, my boss, my team. God, life would be so much easier if we all got this. And I've never really had a good model or opportunity to sit on and sort of create the manual about that. But I've got a great co-author who's been doing that with me, doing heavy lifting of the writing. And we got a whole lot about exactly this topic. Lack of role clarity, lack of standards in terms of how you manage meetings, how you manage email. Those things, you can have the brightest people in the world, but the lack of a structure for the team is just going to suck energy out of everybody's sails.
That was actually one of the topics I was interested in asking you about around organizational implementation, because I would guess, and maybe this was the approach when you first started with Lockheed or others, of I would assume some people thought if we can just teach everyone GTD, then the team will work more effectively. And I'm curious your thoughts on that, because you're writing a book that I assume is not just put everyone through. Is that right? Okay.
That's true. Of course. No, we see it all. We've got great case studies. The whole team got it. Some of them bitched and moaned and, whatever, but they were starting to be held standard to those standards, keeping agreements, keeping track of your agreements, keeping track of other people's agreements that they make with you that you care about.
Okay.
Two of the biggest things when I've coached executives over the years that they would say, this is just worth the price of admission. 2 lists, waiting for, and agendas.
Yep.
What did you give to somebody? What are you waiting on to come back from some other source or some other person? And What do you need to talk to this person or them about the next time you engage with them? An agenda list. Those two things, most executives actually don't have that,
Right.
surprisingly enough. Your military man might, I don't know, but or he's tasked somebody on his staff to track all that, either one. But those, and again, it's not rocket science unless you're building rockets. It's funny, I was doing a program for JPL, out in Pasadena many years ago, and I said, just off the hand, hey, this ain't rocket science. They go, yes, it is.
Well, and I will say, when I looked at the gaps in my own implementation, it was the waiting for list was by far the biggest one. And it was usually, as you can imagine, the next week when I'm about to meet with the client, I glance through what we talked about last time. It's, oh, yes, I did ask the banker a question. They never got back to me. And so now what I'm telling the client is I followed up, but it was, 2 minutes before this meeting.
You're waiting till it blows up instead of when it ought to be navigated in a proactive way that doesn't have that stress and pressure on. Hey, by the way, how are we doing about these things? You said you were need any help on that? Do we need to renegotiate that agreement? How are we doing?
Right. Yeah. And you gave a tip in the book around emails that I'm now using, which is when I send an email, I can put it also in a folder called waiting for. And so the email just goes in there, and then you glance at that folder and you can quickly look through and say, okay, here are these 6 things that I sent out. And that reminds me to do things, but one that I just hadn't quite figured out a simple way to do.
I still do it. I just BCC myself by automatic on any email I send. Then when it flips back in, then I can move it to a waiting for folder or reference the client or whatever.
Mm-hmm. I will say, in your books, it seems like you favor paper more than technology. And I know the book was written in 2001, then re-released. Are you still kind of feeling the same about?
Just for capture.
Okay. Can you say a little bit more about that? So for capture, you prefer paper over using technology. Okay.
No Wi-Fi, no batteries. Right. I made one note right here about Lisbon. They haven't got my hotel yet. Right before I got on with you guys.
Okay.
Right. It's right here. Right. And there's nothing that's not my organization tool. That's my capture tool of things that might need to be thought about or organized. And I live with this, have for 40 years. Right. So it goes to me wherever I go. Yeah. Because it's got all my plastic, and it's got a great notepad, and it's got a great pen. Because your best ideas are not going to happen. Especially the more mature you get. It's not senility, it is sophistication. The more mature you get, the more your good ideas are not going to happen where that idea is going to be implemented. Okay. You'll be buying bread at the store thinking it's something to bring up with that next client. You'll be with that next client remembering you need bread. Right. So sure. One of the most inefficient things people can do is try to keep stuff in their head. Your head is just a crappy office. Yeah. It did not evolve to remember, remind, prioritize, and manage relationships between more than 4 things. That's cognitive science proven now. You're trying to keep more than 4 things in your head, subliminally or otherwise. You can only have one at a time consciously, but a whole lot of spinning in there, those hamsters spinning on those wheels in there. Oh, I need cat food. I need to talk to that client. Oh, yeah, did we have that? Did they get the hotel for it? Yada, yada, yada. As soon as you have more than 4 of those things that are still in your head, you're not going to take a test as well. You're not going to be as present with your client that you want to just be there for and with them, as opposed to having your mind go 43 other places while you're trying to talk to the client. That's one of the worst things a salesperson could do, is not be present when they're face to face with the client. Sure. Right. Yeah. Definitely.
And I like that. And then obviously the reason it works for you is because you trust that you will get back to that piece of paper and figure out what you really have to do, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's the important part.
That's not going to stay there very long. This is going to be, as I will do it right now, this is going to be, because I got to the bottom of that page, torn out and thrown into my physical in tray. That physical in tray, I got a bunch of mail I had this afternoon. That probably going to be empty tonight, or at least by tomorrow morning. Okay. Getting my capture place. So capture, for the most part, for me anyway, is paper-based because it's just easier. Ubiquitous, it's always available to you. It's easy to do. You don't have to click anything. The more clicks you have to do to try to capture something, you won't do it, especially if you're an ADD or ADHD person. Okay. You won't have the patience to do it. Now, digital capture is okay as long as as long as it's not a black hole where that stuff is going in there and you never do anything with it. Right. So that's the problem, is it's not in your face. See, my physical stuff is in my face. So that's why I like paper for that. And I use the paper-based planner. Probably no better tool to see the totality and gestalt of your life than a paper-based planner. where you could pull all of my appropriate lists as well as project support material, as well as client support data. You could put all that in one physical thing in your face that you could have it easy to access into and easy to access out of as you need it, as opposed to click, where is that? Oh my God. I don't care how many screens you got on your desk. You can't, even if you have 3, high-tech screens on your desk with your computer, you're not going to be able to see anything as well as I could see in my paper-based planner. Now, there's good and bad news to both of those. So I've moved to digital in terms of most of my organization and reminders simply because of the value of clicking, connecting, and and all that good stuff you can do in your digital world with tracking that stuff. But there's no better or worse. I know a bunch of tech people that have gone back to paper simply because of that reason. It's more ubiquitous, it's more available, it's more in their face, easier for them to actually manage their thinking about that and capture their thinking about that and access it when they need it.
Yeah, I definitely go back and forth all the time. I think I've used paper, I've used OneNote for the capture, and have had success with both for long periods of time and then switch back. So I'm definitely always thinking through that. I'd like to kind of jump back to the organization implementation, because it sounds like, I can't wait for that book to come out, because that's something that I've tried at almost every organization I've been at. But I'm curious how you deal with the detractors, the people that come into the meetings and they're like, I'm the most organized person in the world, Jamie. I don't need any new system. So how do you deal with those people that feel like they already have it figured out, but then you find later on that they don't? Just don't.
Well, when you find out that they don't, fire them. Or say, gee, how can I help you not have that thing show up as a glitch in your system? I'll show you how I do mine, because modeling is going to be the best way you can train anybody. Okay. Let me show you why I'm leaving at 5 instead of 8.
Yeah.
You curious? If you're not, fine. See, GTD doesn't deliver a solution, it delivers hope. How much people want to take advantage of that's up to them. See, what GTD and implementing the capture, clarify, organize, reflect, and engage, those best practices of how you get stuff under control, in your life and work, those things they don't give you more time, they give you more room. So I guarantee you, any of you guys, whenever you implemented any part of GTD, what it gave you was more room, not more time. It gave you more room. What you did with that room was unique to you. Some people use it to be more creative. Some people use it to be more strategic. Some people use it to be more present. Some people use it to be more service. That's up to you. So we don't tell people, and this methodology doesn't tell you what you should fill your space with. Well, it reminds you that you probably ought to look at your different horizons of commitments to what you're doing in your life and what's important to you. That may mean you want to use your space to learn to paint, like Howard Stern did. Howard's a huge champion of my stuff, and he implemented GTD, gave him room to learn to paint, which he'd always wanted to do. Still keep serious and keep his other entertainment businesses. I can talk about Howard because he did for 6 months on the radio.
Yeah,
about GTD. So it creates room. So if those people don't need any more room. They're not in enough pain. By the way, if they're in their 20s, forget it. Only when they have kids.
That's when you learn how busy you can't keep track of things.
Only when they're promoted to a next level where they, instead of doing the work, they have to manage 10 people doing the work.
Yes.
Right. So wait till they have the need for it, but they're doing fine. They're doing fine according to their own standards. My job has always been to say, hey folks, what if you had nothing on your mind except whatever you want on your mind? What if all that stuff that's distracting you right now was off your mind, but getting done appropriately and automatically, naturally? Would that be cool? So, I spent 40 years trying to figure out how to sell this, guys, and I'm still not that good at it.
Sure.
Well, I think the interesting thing is so what we do at Summit is, part of our onboarding is Tom and I created, probably an hour and 15-minute training where we walk through how both of us use GTD. And so that's part of when someone starts at Summit, that's one of the first videos they watch, is us walking through how we use it. And I think what we find is exactly what you said. A lot of people, so that's a really cool idea. Don't implement it. And then 9 months in, they're so busy. They're like, oh yeah, there's that one video I can go back and rewatch again, or maybe I should read that book and really try to implement that, because they realize that, working at Summit, if you don't have some kind of organization system that gets stuff out of your head, you're going to constantly be distracted. So I think that's a really good point, is let them come to it as opposed to forcing it on them. I think it's a really, really good idea.
That's why the pandemic sort of put it on steroids, the necessity for people to manage themselves. I mean, come on, consultants and salespeople, and we're always living in a hybrid world. There's not new normal for them. This is just normal. Matter of fact, they're suspect if they're in the office because they're not working with a client or doing sales, right? So consultants and salespeople, the pandemic created no different for them. They just work wherever they could do work. What's different is 80% or 90% of the workforce now goes, oh my God, I can't trust walking into an office with a structure that I can trust to keep me focused. Now I have to focus myself.
Interesting. Right? Yes. Our whole company
that's where a lot of the stress came from.
Yeah.
How do I keep my cat from showing up behind me in my Zoom video, or my kids from stealing my bandwidth because they're stealing cars on a virtual game, in the next room.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of a simple idea, but it's true. It's that the world, the way it's changed, you just sped up what was going on anyway. I read some statistic a while ago, and I forget where it was, but that some great percentage, 85% of the American workforce is going to be subcontractors by 2030 or somewhere.
Oh, wow.
You're not going to work for a company. You're going to work with a company to do a project or to be involved in an initiative. And when that's done, you move on.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much you guys have seen that in your world. I mean, the CPAs may be a little more of a stable world than that, but come on, working for yourself is going to be the new name of the game.
Sure.
If it's not already.
With many of our clients, using sort of short-term contractors is going up a lot, and companies like Upwork, where you can say it's just, here's this sort of task, and the gig economy has people grab those kind of things quickly. So yes, I think that need to balance all those things versus a company saying, I'll spoon feed you what needs to be done.
Yeah,
is changing.
And exactly our business model too.
Bosses can't look to see if they're at their desk.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. And so bosses are in as much stress as anybody else because, oh my God, how can I make sure my people are doing? Well, how about you clarify what outcome you're hired them to do? And do you have some sort of measuring and metrics or some sort of a regular review and status reporting so you can see where they are? I
agree completely. I was at a conference recently with the AICPA, so the American Institute of CPAs. And they talked about a study, and I'll get this number approximately right. About 80% of bosses said they don't feel comfortable that they know that their employees are being productive. And the panel answer around that was, we need to get people back in the office. And I'm sitting there thinking, the problem is you don't trust that your employees are getting done. And to your point, David, you haven't been clear on what you need. You haven't been measuring it. That's the problem.
What does done mean?
Yes.
There's another GTD thing that's like, in a way, it's kind of a duh thing, but in another way, it's one of the most sophisticated things that you can come up with. You guys ever had to hire anybody?
Sure.
Yes, all the time.
When was that done? When you found the right person, check off. When they signed the deal, check off. Or when they've been in the organization long enough to know if the immune system wasn't going to spit them out.
That's a good point.
That's a great question.
When is hiring done?
Yeah.
And I don't have the answer to that. But if you don't have the answer to that, you're going to have those little niggly things on the back of it called where they signed on, but I'm not sure that they're doing exactly the way they need to be doing it. And maybe they don't have any training or whatever. And you've got this open loop. You've got a project you haven't finished.
All right, so that's something I need to add to my inbox right there to capture is defining what done looks like in hiring, because what you described is exactly what we go through all the time. Like there's multiple stages in it, and we have a 90-day probationary period where we figure people out and figure if they're the right thing. Is that the right time, or is it, like you said, is there a certain number of clients they have where they're fully integrated as part of the system? So that's something that I definitely need.
And you may not need to do all of that, but you need to keep track of all that.
I need to find it.
Somebody else is doing it. That's right.
Exactly.
You need to keep looking at how we're doing on that.
Mm-hmm.
Who still needs to do something about this to get to that end game so you can check that one off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great example then, Jamie. Yeah.
It's a great
David,
point.
I wonder if you can help me reframe my thinking about one of the parts in the book that I'm struggling with a little bit. So in the book, you give some really good examples of where you can use a next action list. Like you're sitting in a meeting that hasn't started. So what things can you be doing? Or you're waiting for a child an appointment, things like that. And you talk about making room for space. The place where I have a challenge is I think we're building a culture where you fill every single gap with activity. And that's part of it. There's a feeling of when I got the next action list, I can always be doing. How do I make sure I set time aside to sit and think and have long-term things versus I can make 6 different 10-minute phone calls in different times? Somehow I don't know that I'm thinking about it correctly. And I wonder if
no, you're thinking about it absolutely correctly. You just need to go, how important is it for you to get the result of stepping back and thinking?
Okay. Okay. And so then you would set aside the time if it's important enough and say, okay,
well,
so
there's where the horizons come in of GTD. What's your purpose in life? What's your vision of wild success of that purpose being fulfilled? What are the goals you need to complete over the next year or two? What are the things you need to manage and maintain so you get to your goal? What are all the projects you need to finish? What are all the action steps you need to take to move all the moving parts of what you're doing? If you had that inventory totally current and totally clear, you wouldn't have asked that question.
Okay. I could see that. That does make sense. You're right. And so as I think of the implementation, I guess I'm thinking much more in the short term, what I have to get done now. And you're saying there's a longer horizon.
There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes doing that stuff triggers, bigger things to think about. So you're always doing, by the way, you can't stop. You're talking to me right now.
Sure.
If you decide to do nothing, you're doing that.
Yes.
You can't stop. You're teleological. You're always about something. You are always about something.
Okay.
It's just, are you about the right thing? Maybe what you need to be about is stop thinking about anything right now and just let whatever pops into your head pop into your head, and then just deal with it if it's something cool shows up. Late night thinking is where I often do that. Get a glass of wine, whatever. Everybody's to bed. The dogs have been peed and pooped. And I'm sitting there by myself, kind of turn the lights down low and do nothing but pull out my little notepad
Okay.
or whatever might show up. Sometimes nothing, sometimes some of the coolest stuff.
Okay. That's really helpful. I appreciate that.
I don't do that every night. It's just whenever I need the ability to be able to do that and the knowledge to do that when I feel like it.
Well, I think that's a great concept of you're always doing. Like, I think that's a really good thing that I think we need to add into our trainings, Tom, is to let people know, like, you are always doing, whether you're
always visioning.
Yeah.
By the way, you're always visioning.
Mm-hmm.
You guys are visioning talking to me. You're visioning what you're going to do with this once you stop talking to me.
Yep.
You have a vision of getting out of the room. You have a vision of being dressed. You have a vision of having dinner. We can't stop being about things. So when people say, I don't want to set a vision. Oh, come on, that is your vision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I like both of those points. And you're right. It's what you're choosing to do at the time because you're going to be doing things.
So one thing every time, we're writing a whole chapter about the elegance of saying no. And, that's one of the biggest challenges most teams have. Individuals had it to begin with, but if you get GTD, it's a lot easier to say no because you know what your project list is and you know what your bandwidth is. And once you have enough maturity for this, it's easier for you to go, nah, that's a someday maybe for me, or I got some other things I need to do. Can I renegotiate, or can you have somebody else do that? So it's a lot easier to individually have those conversations about what not to take on, but teams have another challenge. When does the team need to know what it can't do because the team is already overwhelmed? See, every time an organization changes anything or anything in its external world changes, it creates new projects. Very few teams curate the old projects and say, which one should we get rid of now?
Sure.
So what they're doing is piling insult on injury. And teams are burning out.
Yeah.
For that reason. So being able to say no, being able to know what to say no to. And right now, how many things are you guys not doing talking to me right now?
Oh,
how many things am I not doing talking to you right now?
Yes.
We've already said no to a gazillion things. Everybody's saying no all the time based upon whatever they choose to do. They're saying no to everything else.
Right.
They just hope that's a good choice.
Yeah. But if you're a team, it'll be on your list and maybe not resourced and not prioritized. It just creates stress.
Exactly.
I think so of corporate exercises.
Whoever owns the team, whoever owns the purpose of the team. So you only have a team if there's a purpose. Why are we a team? What are we trying to accomplish as a team? And somebody needs to own that and be able to own the review of that on some consistent basis. And given the purpose of the team, is this new project we've either been handed or somebody said, let's take on, is that purposeful? Is that on purpose? Or maybe we need to skinny it down to the 3 things we need to do, and let's put 5 on a someday maybe list. That when we get these other things done, we can pull those up and activate them.
And to me, that was one of the really things that set home for me on GTD is it's not just a working to-do list, right? Like this doesn't relate to Summit CPA. And like you said, like I'm part of many teams, right? I'm part of my family. I'm part of Summit. I'm part of a basketball team I coach. Like I'm part of several teams. And like, I don't just limit GTD to my work life. It also has to do with my personal life and with all those teams I'm part of. And so again, that's where it gets complicated is there's just so many different teams that you're interacting with and how they work together and how to make sure that all of them and you prioritize them correctly. And I think that's what I love about GTD is it's not just this is only for your work life. It's for your life, and it makes your whole life a lot more clear.
Yeah. Well, Jamie, you might find it interesting. I implemented Holacracy, the sort of self-organizing organizational model 10 years ago. And one of the basic protocols in Holacracy is you do not make a commitment with anybody about any time commitment until you go back and look at your whole weekly review and your whole thing, because you're making a commitment not knowing all the other stuff you've got on your plate.
Mm-hmm.
So you better know what all the stuff is on your plate. And so we don't make commitments about time. We might say, let me get back to you about that. Here's when you'd like that, but I'll get back to you as to whether I can do it then or if we need to renegotiate a time frame. So that's a pretty mature professional discussion, but also your basketball team, they'd ask you to do what? And you go, I don't know, let me see.
Yep.
If you haven't done a good weekly review in the last week, if you've at least done a monthly weekly review, you'll be in a better state to make a judgment call about what you can and can't commit to. But very few teams do that.
No, yeah, that's great because I think that, and it's come out from a couple of different things you said, is like when you are choosing to do stuff, you're prioritizing different commitments. And so if you just say, oh yeah, I'll do that today, what are you putting to the back when you're deciding to do something today just because you're in a call and you want to be attentive and you want to be that best client service person, say I'll get that done today, but what are you putting to the back that's going to upset someone else or put someone else out of the priority? So
sure.
there's all those competing priorities that when you commit to something that you're throwing to the side. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
And then you also have, come on, you guys are probably better at this than me, and just in terms of sales management. I mean, your 80-20 rule.
Mm-hmm.
Who's working with the easy client as opposed to the one that's really going to give them the payoff?
Yeah.
And how can they put the easy client a little bit more on the back burner because they're easy to negotiate and deal with, and spend some really rigorous time strategizing about how they're going to go for the low-hanging fruit and the big client. So that's again more content in terms of how they're thinking about this stuff. But again, if they don't have all of that stuff externalized in terms of what are all of my opportunities and clients, and a lot of salespeople, should and probably appropriately consider big clients a project. My project is to optimize my relationship with this client, or either get to a go or no go decision by the client. And those become projects. Again, part of the subtlety of defining what a project is. When is done with this client? Done is done maybe when I've just got a great relationship with them. They said no this year, but let's check them on a budget next year. We might be able to do something fabulous. And then you put that on your calendar and you get it, you tickle it. So yada, 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 and do what you do to manage that relationship, but get that relationship on cruise control. Those are projects for salespeople. How do I get this relationship onto cruise control? So I don't have any attention on this at 3 o'clock in the morning.
That's an interesting idea, Dave. And the other thing I think of, and I don't think of my clients as projects, I have projects within clients, but the way you're framing it also, I think, is a much more proactive way. Because if you don't do that, then it's much more, what has the client asked me to do? I'll get all those things done. And that gets you a certain level of service.
Well, you could also reframe it in the areas of focus, Horizon 2, which is areas of focus and accountability and responsibility. And you could put those clients on that called client
Sure.
management could be part of that. And then you could just review that regularly to then see what projects you might need to have about any one of those. So
Yeah.
that works fine too.
Okay.
Great.
One of the things that strikes me, and I'm curious if you agree that with this, you give lots of individual tips. And I've heard you say, like in one of the, I think the 2-day, maybe the 1-day conference, hey, if this is, many people say just the 2-minute rule, if you can just do that, you get a great benefit. And so you talk a lot about individual things that you could do that could help. And I don't hear you say you have to implement the entire GTD system to get benefit from it. And I really appreciate that, because I think some people can say, okay, it feels overwhelming maybe, or maybe I'll do these 1 or 2 tips, which likely has them say, that's so good, I should be exploring and seeing if there are other things.
Yeah, that's the best approach. Absolutely. I agree.
Okay. I'm curious, what do you think is the best way for people to stick with GTD for long-term? If someone says, I follow it, are there 1 or 2 things you're like, are you doing this to tell you, okay, you actually are, or you're not, or is that not really how you think about it?
Stick around people doing it.
Oh, interesting. Other people are talking about doing it.
You'll only go running on a regular basis unless you're really, really disciplined. If you got a bunch of mates that you go running with.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So just
Interesting. Yeah.
good to get around people doing this and then have this standard, in terms of doing it. Otherwise, Tom, the biggest barrier to people implementing this fully is their addiction to stress.
Addiction to
not
what?
so much
Stress. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
They're willing to tolerate this ambient anxiety that hangs out because they don't do this.
Okay.
See, once you get used to no ambient anxiety, then it's like, oh, I now I'm feeling a little ambient anxiety. I got to fix it. So, there comes a point in the maturity of your work with this methodology. Up until that point, you can get thrown off very easily. I suddenly had a sickness I didn't expect. I suddenly got this situation in my company that happened, and I couldn't keep track. I suddenly had a 3-week trip, and I lost control of yada, yada, yada. I fell off the wagon. So you guys fell off the wagon, right? You mentioned that, right? What you didn't do was go, wow, I'm off the wagon. I need to get back on. You didn't do that very quick. You did that when things changed or when you got stressed by another kind of thing.
Yes.
I can't go but a few hours with ambient anxiety before I fix it.
Okay.
I got used to not having it. So it's like, the same reason I brush my teeth and take showers. If I don't, the scud factor gets too high.
Yeah.
So you guys had to wait for a while for the scud factor to get high enough to get back to the game.
For sure.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great.
So if you say, how do I change that? Beats me, other than have people just somehow experience this. Because it's hard to get into GTD until you actually do some of it.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead and write down the top 10 things on your mind right now and decide the next action on each one and see how different you feel. I could tell them that would be a good thing to do, and they go, yeah, that's probably a good thing to do. And if they don't do it, they get no value out of that other than, okay, there's something I could do, it might be useful. But if they actually sat down and did that, they go,
Yes.
oh, wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
So getting used to feeling in control and stress-free and having space to be present with whatever you're doing, getting used to that is just however long it takes you to get used to that. Some people get it right away because they're close to it anyhow, and they see my stuff and they go, those are just the pieces I needed. And they get there and they're on after a couple of weeks. Some people a couple of months, some people a couple of years, some people never. Don't shoot the messenger, guys. I'm just
sure.
No, I love it.
That makes sense.
It's exactly what I experienced with myself and with the team is exactly what you're talking about. So as we wrap up here and we get close to the end of time, one thing we like to end all of our shows with is a final thought. So I know we've hit a lot of different topics here. We've talked about a lot. Hopefully this brings some new people to your book and to your process, because I know there's been I've written down a lot of things here that are sitting in my inbox right now that you've brought for me, but I'd love to I'll start with you, David, your kind of final thought for our listeners of one thing they should take away from this podcast.
Your ideas for having ideas, not holding them.
Great. That's a good one. All right, Tom, what about you? What's your kind of final thought from this podcast?
I think the reframing that David gave us at the very beginning, where you and I said, okay, we're in back-to-back meetings, sort of how do you manage within that? And the thinking about, okay, does it have to be that way? And the question was, who controls those and why does it have to be like that? And I think there are many parts of what we do that you could stop and say, is this really the best environment? And maybe I change the environment versus trying to be efficient within it.
Nope, that's great. And there's two things that I took away. I think this is the highest one. I think I'm going to go back to the paper. I like the way you show the paper and the paper inbox. I think that does make it a little bit more visual. So I think that's one of the things that I'm going to definitely think about doing. And I think the second one that you've talked about a couple different times in here is prioritize, not just for myself, but for my team, and make sure everybody knows what their priorities are and what their goals are for their job and for their day. And I think that will make make GTD a lot easier to implement, because like you said, you're making a choice to do something all the time. Every even when you're sleeping, you're making a choice to do something, right? So I think that what are your priorities will make those choices a little bit easier. So that's definitely kind of my final thoughts for this episode. So definitely appreciate you coming on. As you probably could realize through this podcast, both Tom and I are huge fans, and this was an honor for both of us to have you on here. And we really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us.
Fine, guys. This was fun. Yeah, good stuff. Yay.
Great.
Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Yes.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy this podcast? Visit our website at summitcpa.net to get more tips and strategies for achieving business success. We're here to be a resource in this ever-changing industry.